The opening of Gray's Elegy would have been to the 18th century reader a clear indication that this is a poem of sensibility as opposed to poetry of reason. The first 28 lines give us the time and place, and the description is a meditative reflection of the countryside, as in Thomson's The Seasons. From the very start, we perceive an underlying note of melancholy in the poem, but it is not the graveyard melancholy or a despondent brooding over some obscure fact of decadence. Here, the melancholy is a kind of emotional stimulant to sensibility, and the type of sensibility is identified in the epitaph. The sense that something exists beyond the solemn stillness of the air and the glimmering landscape, a kind of traditional wisdom and knowledge perhaps. So the melancholy undercurrent of the poem is not simply the indulgence in overwrought feelings, but a cue for a rich contemplation on the nature of the human condition. The poet contemplates on the rural world, but he has in his mind at the same time the other world of maddening crowd, of pomp and luxury and power. This leads us into a number of questions. Who is the poem about? Is it an elegy on the village dead, or is it a poem about the poet himself? And if it is indeed about the poet, the epitaph then falls into place. Different characters are identified: I, thou, which is the humble rustic poet, the hoary-headed swain, and the kindred spirit, the poet himself perhaps, contemplating his own death. The last part of the poem is entirely about the poet singing as it were a dirge in the air, and most volubly in the epitaph itself. This, however, induces us to think that the poem is not an elegy for the humble dead, it is actually one for the poet himself. And the direction of the poem indicates that what we have in the end of the poem is the poet making a choice. The earlier parts of the poem lay down the contemplation for that moment of choice. This provides the poet with a reason to meditate, and it is not only the poet indulging in a reflective meditation, but also the reader. The beginning of the poem then must be read in terms of the conclusion. That would determine what the poet is actually doing in the churchyard. Interestingly, the epitaph is like a prologue because it prepares us, and so by a leap of imagination we can grasp that the kindred spirit is the reader himself, who will understand, unlike the hoary-headed swain, the kind of choice he has made. The epitaph tells us who the poet is and what choice he made. The village dead, while they were living, could in no way achieve fame and glory, because as Gray tells us, their lot forbade, and they were left with no option but to lead an austere life that simply led to the crude and undecorated grave. But the youth mentioned in the epitaph was left with a choice, and since fair signs frowned on his humble birth, he had the opportunity to be honor's favorite, fortune's darling. But he did not grab that opportunity, because melancholy marked him for her own. It is significant to note that the line begins not with but, it begins with and melancholy marked him for her own. This does not imply that education made him aware of the possibilities he could not fulfill. It is not the case that education made him melancholy. He is unknown to fame and fortune because he was animated by melancholy, which is a special kind of sensibility, something which expresses itself in benevolence of generosity and altruistic values, and not merely in isolated wanderings. We have a picture of the poet built up in the first part of the epitaph, a man who was not only educated but melancholy. Thus, he has wandered away from the town, being a man of benevolence, altruism. He was a man of social virtue, bounty, sincerity. He gave to misery all he had, and a tear was all he had. Tear is then the elegy itself. It is all that he leaves behind. The epitaph, therefore, positions the poet in the fading twilight of the darkening landscape. It also identifies a structure. In giving all he had, he died like a martyr. Before his death, he had understood the fleeting nature of fame and fortune. He could renounce the meretricious objects and depthless virtues for something more profound, something more permanent. The 18th century conception of the poet is therefore dismantled. The poet as the man of the world, the poet as the objective observer, is replaced by the poet as a messianic wanderer, filled with wisdom, forsaking the world, for he seeks that which is infinitely more rewarding, something which the poet has left behind, the poem itself, the art. The epitaph looks back at the opening setting where we have a wanderer in a country churchyard. The time is with the twilight and the visual description loaded with significance, and we are introduced to a landscape of fading daylight where our senses become fully aware of the images and sounds and a sense of finality. And we see the poet wandering across the country churchyard contemplatively. When total darkness falls upon the scene and the glimmering landscape fades on the side, the world is filled with silence, only to be disturbed now and then by the drowsy tinklings and the moping owl. The visual and the auditory are juxtaposed to provide a vivid experience. The visual fixes us into the here and now. The auditory takes us into several directions. The images that the poet evokes suggest a kind of melancholy mood. Curfew tolls, lowing herd, glimmering landscape. The solitary presence of the weary ploughman enhances the sense of loneliness, and in this solitude we see the poet contemplating themes that are much more universal and philosophical, that of human existence, life and death. He seems to have come a long way from the artificial and meretricious urbanity of the town life. From line 16 we have the next movement. Having contemplated the landscape, the poet now imagines the life of the rude forefathers of the hamlet before they died, and this life is imagined, evoked not in darkness but daylight. This works like a flashback where we are taken to the past, where we see the life they once lived, their homely, beautiful life, their innocent fun, their familial and domestic virtues. There is a poetic glow which animates this picture of the life they led, and in recalling that life of humble rustic sweetness, the poet is actually identifying the elegiac quality. He also finds a positive virtue in their simplicity. This leads to the next movement of thought. Having found something positive in this life of the villagers, he goes on to point at the conventional attitude to country life. So he defends the village dead from the conventional attitude towards the country, mockery, disdain, and contempt. He admits that the country life is homely, obscure, short, simple, but it is not something to be mocked, because in this life there is a virtue and an idyllic beauty which is unperceived by the world. And it is in this defending the country way of living and the country people that the poet, as mentioned in the epitaph, is actually giving all he has bounteously. This section of the poem abounds in personifications, grandeur, ambition, memory, honor, flattery, and this conforms to the neoclassical tradition. But Gray applies them in a new context. He defends the country people from these personified abstractions. It is significant here that all the abstractions are not open to rhetorical analysis. For example, memory does not really have a person behind it. It is not an abstract for the concrete. Memory is the elaborately ornamented piece erected on the grave of a person for the purpose of remembrance. Patience was another figure who was sometimes present above a grave, as in Patience on a monument in Twelfth Night. The village dead may not have his grave elaborately decorated, but the uncouth rhymes and the shapeless sculpture serve the purpose of remembering. It does not make one little difference where one is born, town or country, what one's occupation is. Only one thing that counts is being mourned for, being remembered as a benevolent spirit. The rich and the powerful may erect monuments and trophies may be raised in their honor, but once life is lived, their monuments cannot bring them back to life. All their glories, fame, fortune are hurled to dust by the simple, inexplicable occurrence of their passing away. In this sense, they are not much different from the rude forefathers of the hamlet, who now lie under their graves. We have come a long way from the beginning. From lamenting the death of the village people, Gray has moved into philosophical realms, and his contemplation moves from the particular to the universal. Life, death, and human achievements, with a profound and intensely elegiac recognition that the paths of glory lead but to the grave. Death levels all.